Hi. In today's video, we're going to be discussing a fault-tolerant strategy known as the static lookup result. So, with our static lookup, essentially the idea behind this is we would use this strategy if we're trying to look up some data against a static source. So this could be some kind of reference material. So say, for instance, you're looking up, a list of states, or you're looking up zip codes, or, a type of animal or something like that, where it's a static list that really isn't going to be changing very often. So the goal of this is to really be able to provide results back to the client when the initial lookup fails, and the data is static. Well, it's relatively static. So, one of the issues that you can run into with this is that I mentioned that this is relatively static. There's only going to be a finite number of things that you can actually go and put into a static list. Generally, in MuleSoft, what you could do with this is do something like add it into a properties file, or something like that that can be configured in the at the runtime when you're actually deploying this application. But you're not going to be able to put every possible option out there. So the idea behind this is a static list. So you're going to try and do a lookup and see what you can come up with. Sometimes you may not be able to come up with it. But if, the information is on that list and you have a finite list, you'll be able to return that data pretty cleanly. So with that being said, let's see what it's going to look like in practice. So for this, as always, we're going to have our client that's actually going to be calling the API. We're going to have our fault-tolerant API. We're going to have our final data source. And keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily have to be a lookup. It could be another API call or something like that. And then finally, like I said, because we are doing a static lookup, we're going to have a static data source. And again, this could be some kind of a properties file or something along those lines. So, first thing that's going to be happening is our client is going to be making our call to the fault-tolerant API. The fault-tolerant API is going to be passing that along to the data source. And the data source is then going to be returning, but we're going to return a failure here. This is not going to be, it's not going to be successful. So like any good fault-tolerant API, we're going to have a retry strategy. So we're going to retry back to our data source. Again, where it's going to fail. Now, this API knows that its data source is a static list, and it has a list that it can go and look up against, be it a property file, something along those lines. So it knows that it can go reach out to its static data source and do a lookup. We're going to find that data source and return that back up to the API. And in turn, the response back to the client will look just like we were able to retrieve it successfully from the data source, but we're actually getting it from a static data source. So, with all that being said, this is the static lookup fallback strategy. Our intent is really going to be providing data back to the client when the actual lookup fails, but the data is going to be a static lookup type of data. So we'll be able to use a static lookup source, which will be like a properties file, something like that. And at the end of the day, the client's really not going to be able to see the difference between whether we were able to reach out directly to the data source or down to the static data source if the data exists there. So with that being said, this is our static lookup fallback strategy. And thank you. Have a great day.